Welcome once again to Godfrey Story Time. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel, kindly subscribe to this channel because there's more amazing stories that are popping up here. And without wasting much time, let's get into an interesting story today. Kindly let's listen.
The morning of my son Daniel's 38th birthday, I woke up early, the way I always do when something important is on my mind. I went to the kitchen, made a cup of chamomile tea, and sat by the window watching the birds gather at the feeder outside. I had been planning what to say for days. Not because calling my own child should be complicated, but because lately, nothing about our relationship felt simple anymore. Still, it was his birthday. And no matter what had happened between us, I told myself that a mother does not let her child's birthday pass in silence. I picked up the phone with a warm feeling in my chest, the kind only a mother knows, and I dialed his number. It rang twice. Then a voice answered. Not Daniel's voice. It was Clara, his wife. Her tone was flat, almost bored, as if picking up my call was an inconvenience she had already prepared herself for. She did not say hello. She did not say good morning. What she said was this: Margaret, Daniel does not want to hear from you anymore. He has moved on. You are no longer needed in his life. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. I sat very still. I did not cry. I did not argue. I just sat there holding the phone, staring at the bird feeder outside, watching a little sparrow peck at the seeds I had poured that morning. Nobody had asked the sparrow to prove she belonged there. She just did. I was 67 years old. I had raised Daniel alone after his father left when Daniel was just 4. I had worked 2 jobs for 11 years so Daniel could have new shoes every school year and lunch money in his pocket every single day. I had skipped vacations, worn the same winter coat for 6 years, and eaten leftovers for dinner more nights than I could count, all so that my son could have more than I did. And now the woman he had married 3 years ago, a woman I had welcomed into my home with open arms and a full table, was telling me over the phone that I was no longer needed. I hung up without saying goodbye. Then I sat alone in my kitchen for a very long time. What made it worse was that I had tried so hard with Clara from the very beginning. When Daniel first brought her home, I made her favorite meal even though I had to call Daniel twice to find out what it was. I gave her the good guest room with the quilt my mother had made by hand. I told her she was beautiful on their wedding day, and I meant it. I had spent $400 on a gift for that wedding, money I had set aside little by little over several months. I had babysat their 2 children, Lily and Noah, more times than anyone had ever counted or thanked me for. I had driven 40 minutes each way, every single Tuesday, so Clara could take her yoga class without worrying about childcare. And still I was no longer needed. In the days that followed that birthday phone call, I waited. I am not sure what I was waiting for exactly. Maybe an apology. Maybe Daniel's voice on the line, calling to say that Clara had spoken out of turn and that of course he still wanted me in his life. But the phone stayed quiet. No message. No missed call. Nothing. I checked it more times than I would like to admit, sitting in my chair by the window, watching the birds, drinking tea that went cold before I finished it. The silence from my son was louder than anything Clara had ever said. It told me everything I had been afraid to believe. 2 weeks after that morning, my phone buzzed. I looked down and saw a text from Clara. No greeting, no lead-up. It simply said, "Can you watch Lily and Noah this weekend? We have plans and need someone." I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone down on the table and looked out at the bird feeder for a long moment. I thought about the sparrow again. I thought about how I had poured those seeds not because anyone asked me to, but because I wanted to, because it gave me joy, because I believed that caring for something small and living was always worth doing. But I also knew that a feeder works best when the birds actually want to be there. I picked up the phone and typed back slowly and carefully. I said, "Didn't you tell me I was no longer needed?" Then I put the phone down again and went back to my tea. The response came fast. Faster than anything had come from that number in weeks. Clara said I was being dramatic. She said I had taken her words the wrong way. She said Daniel was just going through a stressful time and that she had only been trying to protect him. I did not respond. I understood then what I had been slow to see for a very long time. I had been useful to them when they needed something. The rest of the time I was supposed to make myself invisible. That evening I called my oldest friend, a woman named Ruth who had known me since we were both young mothers pushing strollers through the same park 30 years ago. I told her everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Margaret, how long have you been letting them treat you like a light switch? On when they need you, off when they don't?" I did not have a good answer. The truth was that I had been letting it happen for years. Not all at once, but slowly, the way a sweater unravels when you pull at just one loose thread. Each small slight I had forgiven, each dismissal I had excused, each dinner I had cooked and eaten alone because they cancelled at the last minute. Ruth asked me when I had last done something just for myself. Not for Daniel, not for Clara, not for the grandchildren I adored. Just for me. I had to think for a very long time before I could answer. I finally said I had planted a small herb garden on my back porch in the spring, and I had done that just because I wanted fresh basil in my kitchen. Ruth laughed a little and said, "Good. Start there. Sounds like such a small thing." But that conversation opened something in me that I had kept shut for a very long time. The idea that I was allowed to take up space in my own life, that my needs and my time and my peace were worth something, even when no one else was assigning them value. The next morning I did not check my phone first thing. That was new for me. For years I had started every day reaching for that little screen, hoping for a message from Daniel, a photo of the grandchildren, something to make me feel connected to the family I had spent my whole life building. Instead I got up slowly, made my tea, went outside to water my herb garden, and stood in the early light for a few minutes doing absolutely nothing. Felt strange at first, like wearing shoes on the wrong feet. But I stayed with it. And by the time I came back inside, something had shifted in me, something very small but very real. I felt, for the first time in a long while, like the morning belonged to me. I began to make small changes. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. Something I had always wanted to try but had always talked myself out of because it conflicted with being available. Available for babysitting, available for last-minute favors, available for all the ways I had made myself indispensable to people who had just told me I was not needed. The first class was on a Thursday evening. I drove there alone, sat down at a table covered in newspaper with a little cup of brushes in front of me, and painted the worst apple anyone has ever seen in the history of art. My teacher, a kind woman named Frances, told me it had character. I laughed for the first time in weeks. I also began to look honestly at what I had given over the years. Not to punish myself or anyone else, but simply to see clearly what had been true. I had loaned Daniel and Clara $6,000 when they moved into their house 3 years ago. They had called it a loan. I had called it a loan. It had never been mentioned again. I had bought the crib and the changing table when Lily was born. I had stocked their freezer with meals after Noah arrived. I had paid for the children's winter coats every year because Clara always said they were so expensive and I always said do not worry about it. Somewhere along the way I had taught them not to worry about it. And then they had stopped worrying about me too. 3 days after I did not respond to Clara's babysitting request, Daniel called. My heart did the old familiar leap when I saw his name on the screen. Some things do not change no matter how much you want them to. I let it ring once while I took a breath. Then I answered. He did not say happy birthday to himself. He did not apologize for the silence. He said, in the careful voice of someone who has rehearsed, "Mom, Clara said you're not responding to messages. The kids are asking about you. We just want things to be normal." I asked him what normal meant to him. He paused for a long time. Waited. I had spent years filling his silences with my words, so he would not have to feel uncomfortable. This time I let it be quiet. He said he did not know why I was being so difficult. That word, difficult, sat in my chest like a small sharp pebble. I had heard it before in small ways, in glances between him and Clara when I asked to see the children more often, in the slight edge in his voice when I called at what he considered the wrong time. But hearing it said plainly like that, I understood something. I was difficult because I had stopped being easy. And I had been easy for so long, always accommodating, always adjusting, always making myself smaller so that everyone around me could feel bigger. Being difficult just meant I had started to take up my own space. I told Daniel I loved him. I always will. I told him that I had always done everything I could for him and that I would not stop loving him no matter what. But I also told him that I could not keep showing up for people who only called when they needed something from me. I told him I deserved to be more than convenient. He was quiet again. Then he said he would talk to Clara and call me back. He has not called back yet. I do not know if he will. But something that surprised me was that I was okay. Sad, yes. Missing him, absolutely. But okay in a way I had not felt in years because I had told the truth without apologizing for it. My watercolor class met again the following Thursday. This time I painted a small blue bowl sitting on a white cloth. Francis said my sense of light was getting better. I don't know if that was true or just kindness, but I held on to it. After class, a woman named Dottie, who always sat 2 seats down from me, asked if anyone wanted to get coffee at the diner across the street. 3 of us went. We sat for 2 hours talking about everything and nothing, our children, our gardens, a book someone had read, a trip someone was planning. I drove home in the dark, feeling full in a way that had nothing to do with food. Dottie and I began meeting for coffee on Monday mornings. She was 72, had 4 grown children who called regularly, and a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. She had been widowed 6 years ago and had, in her words, spent the first year crying and the second year figuring out who she was without someone else to organize her life around. She said the 3rd year was the best year she had ever had. I told her about Daniel and Clara. She listened without interrupting, which is a rare and generous thing. When I finished, she said, "You gave him roots and he forgot to give you wings." I thought about that for a long time after. A month passed. Then another. Clara sent one more message asking if I could help with the children during a school holiday week. I replied politely that I was not available that week. That was true. I had signed up for a 3-day watercolor workshop that Ruth had found for me online, held at a little art center an hour from home. Clara did not respond. Daniel sent a short text saying he hoped I was well. I replied that I was and that I hoped the same for him. We were polite as strangers. It was painful in a way I did not expect, that quiet politeness where warmth used to live. But I also knew that pretending the warmth was still there when it had been so carelessly handled would have hurt me more. The watercolor workshop was 3 of the best days I had spent in years. There were 11 of us in a light-filled room with big windows looking out at a meadow. Our instructor was a man named Elliot who painted every day and spoke about color the way some people speak about music, as if it were alive and always moving. I painted a field of lavender on the 2nd day, and it actually looked like lavender. I stood back and looked at it with my head tilted and felt something I can only describe as pride. Not the kind of pride that needs someone else to confirm it. Just my own quiet knowing that I had made something real with my own 2 hands. On the last evening of the workshop, a few of us sat outside on a wooden deck and watched the sun go down over the meadow. Someone had brought a bottle of sparkling cider, and we passed it around in little plastic cups. I thought about where I had been 1 year ago, sitting in my kitchen waiting for a phone call that did not come, measuring my worth by how much I was needed. And I thought about where I was right now, sitting in the fading light with people who had chosen to spend their evening with me not because I had offered them anything but simply because they enjoyed my company. Felt like the difference between being tolerated and being welcomed. Ruth drove up to spend a weekend with me in early autumn. We walked every morning, made big breakfasts, talked until late. She slept in the guest room with the quilt my mother had made and said it was the coziest bed she had ever slept in. We went to the farmer's market on Saturday and I bought more vegetables than 2 people could reasonably eat, and we made a big pot of soup and ate it for dinner with bread from the bakery around the corner. It was such an ordinary weekend. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody needed anything from anyone. We were just 2 old friends being good to each other. I did not realize how much I had missed that simple thing. One afternoon while Ruth and I were sitting in the garden, my phone rang. It was a number I did not recognize at first. Then I saw the area code and remembered. It was my sister Patricia, who lived 3 states away and with whom I had barely spoken in 2 years. Not because of any falling out but simply because life had gotten busy and I had let the distance grow. She said she had been thinking about me and just wanted to call to say hello. We talked for almost an hour. She told me about her garden, her cat, a funny thing that happened at her book club. I told her about the watercolor class, about Dottie, about the lavender painting. She laughed and said she always knew I was an artist. After I hung up with Patricia, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for so long I had forgotten it was there. I had let so many connections drift away in the years. I had poured everything into Daniel and Clara. Not intentionally. Just quietly. The way a garden goes untended when you are always tending someone else's. Now I was beginning to water my own garden again, calling back people I had missed, showing up to things I had always said yes to in theory but no to in practice, letting myself matter to people who had room for me. Patricia and I started a habit of calling every Sunday afternoon. It sounds like such a small thing, but it became one of the anchors of my week. She would call at 2 o'clock and we would talk until one of us had to start dinner. We caught up on decades of small details we had missed. The kind that do not make it into holiday cards or birthday messages but that make up the real texture of a life. I learned that she had started baking sourdough bread, and that her cat was named Gerald, and that she had been thinking of taking a pottery class. She learned about my herb garden and my watercolor paintings and Dottie's laugh and the sparrow on the feeder. Winter arrived slowly that year, the way it does when you are actually paying attention to the seasons instead of just enduring them. I put extra seeds in the bird feeder and watched the cardinals come, the bright red males and the quieter brownish females, both of them equally at home. I bought myself a good wool blanket for the reading chair by the window, something I had been meaning to do for years and had always put off in favor of spending money on other people's things. I made myself a cup of proper hot chocolate one cold afternoon, not from a packet but from real cocoa and warm milk and a little cinnamon, and I sat with it by the window and read a novel that had been sitting on my shelf for 8 months. It was during that quiet winter that I began to understand something I had always heard but never quite felt in my body. The saying that you cannot pour from an empty cup. For so many years I had tried to pour anyway, shaking out the last drops, holding the cup upside down and waiting for something to fall, all while believing that giving everything was the same as being loved. But giving everything and being loved are not the same thing. One is about what you offer. The other is about who sees you. Daniel had taken what I offered for years without truly seeing me. And I had let that go on because seeing me had never been required of him. I had always filled the silence before he noticed it was there. February brought an unexpected development. I received a letter in the mail, actual paper and ink, from Daniel. He had always been better on paper than on the phone, even as a child, leaving notes for me when he was upset rather than saying things out loud. The letter was 3 pages. Handwritten in the careful printing he had used since grade school. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he knew that Clara's phone call on his birthday had been unkind, and that he should have called me himself to talk about whatever was bothering him instead of letting her handle it. He said he was sorry for the silence. He said he missed me. I read the letter 3 times. I cried on the second read. Not from sadness exactly, but from the strange mix of feelings that comes when someone you love finally says the thing you needed to hear but were not sure would ever come. I set it down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. Then I made tea and read it a 3rd time. Daniel's letter did not fix everything. 3 pages of honest handwriting could not undo years of being treated as optional. But it was something real. It was him making an effort with no return guarantee. No practical favor on the other end of it. It was just him reaching toward me because he missed me. That mattered. I took several days before I wrote back. I wanted to respond from a clear place, not from the old automatic forgiveness that would have rushed in before and smoothed everything over without any real reckoning. I sat with my thoughts. I talked to Ruth. I went to my watercolor class and painted a winter tree against a pale sky and thought about what I actually wanted to say. When I finally sat down to write, I told Daniel that I loved him and always would. I told him that his letter meant a great deal to me. I also told him, gently but clearly, that I needed our relationship to be different going forward. That I needed to be treated as a person and not a resource. That I wanted us to rebuild something real. He called the day after I sent the letter. This time it was his voice, just his, no Clara in the background. He sounded younger somehow, the way people sound when they let the prepared speech go and just talk. He said he did not realize how much he had leaned on me without truly seeing me. He said Clara had her own complicated feelings about mothers and family, and that he had too often let her lead the way in how they handled things, including things involving me. He was not making excuses. He said it more like a man trying to understand something about himself out loud, which I respected more than any polished apology would have been. We talked for almost 2 hours that first call. We talked about his childhood, which surprised me, memories he brought up that I did not know he still carried. The time I drove through a snowstorm to pick him up from a school trip because the buses were cancelled and I did not want him to wait in the cold. The summer I saved enough to take us both to see the ocean for the first time, just the two of us, when he was 12 and I was not yet 40 and the world still felt like it had a lot of open road in it. He said he had been thinking about those things. I had not known he remembered them with any particular feeling attached. The conversation eventually turned to Clara. I did not push into that territory. I let him bring it up in his own time. He said that Clara had grown up in a home where asking for help was seen as weakness and where emotional needs were handled by not having them. He said she sometimes turned those habits outward without realizing it. He said he had not talked to her honestly about any of this yet, but that he needed to. Listen, I did not say anything bad about Clara. Not because I was performing patience, but because I genuinely believed that whatever was wrong between us was not going to be fixed by me tearing her down in her husband's ear. That spring I planted more in my garden than I ever had before. Tomatoes, peppers, 3 kinds of herbs, a row of sunflowers along the back fence just because I had always loved them and had never before given myself permission to grow something purely decorative. Dottie came over one Saturday and we spent the afternoon in the dirt together, which sounds ordinary but felt like something close to joy. She brought seedlings she had started indoors and we found space for them among mine. By the time we came inside, both of us earthy and laughing, I thought about how much room I had been holding open in my life all along and simply not filling. Daniel began calling every week. Not every day, not dramatic gestures, just a steady and real presence that was more nourishing than any number of big moments would have been. We would talk about what he was working on, what the children were up to, small things. He sent me a photo of Lily wearing a pair of rain boots decorated with little frogs and I laughed out loud in my kitchen. He sent me a photo of Noah holding a caterpillar with enormous pride. I pinned both photos to the little corkboard above my kitchen desk and looked at them while I had my morning tea. They reminded me that love, when it is real, does not have to be complicated. Clara and I did not speak for several months after the birthday call. Daniel did not push me toward her and I did not push either. I think we both understood that something real had to shift before a polite conversation would be worth anything to either of us. What changed it was small and unexpected. I received a voicemail one Tuesday afternoon. Clara's voice, quieter than I had ever heard it, saying she was calling because she owed me an apology and she wanted to say it herself rather than through Daniel. She said she had been wrong to tell me I was not needed. She said she knew it had been a cruel thing to say and that she was sorry. She did not explain herself at length or offer a long list of reasons. She just said she was sorry. I have learned over my 67 years that a simple and direct apology, the kind that does not ask you to forgive the person in the same breath it asks forgiveness, is quite rare and quite worth receiving graciously. I called her back the next morning and I thanked her for calling. I told her I accepted her apology. We talked for about 15 minutes. It was careful and a little formal, like two people who have agreed to start over and are not yet sure what the new thing between them will look like. But it was honest. And honesty, I have found, is the only real foundation anything can be built on. The $6,000 Daniel and Clara had borrowed had never come up again in any of our conversations. I had decided, quietly and on my own, that I was releasing it. Not because the money did not matter, it did, and I had not been flush with it when I gave it, but because I understood that holding on to it as a ledger would poison whatever new thing we were trying to build. Money between family members is tricky and painful and never really just about money. I let it go in my heart first. Then I let it go in practice by simply never mentioning it. What I would not let go was the expectation going forward that I would be treated with basic dignity. That was not negotiable. My sister Patricia came to visit in the spring, the first time she had been to my home in 4 years. I made up the guest room with fresh linens and the handmade quilt. I cooked her favorite soup and we opened a bottle of wine and sat talking until well past midnight. She looked around my house and said it felt different than she remembered it. Asked her how. She said it felt lived in. Lit up. Like someone actually happy lived here. Thought about that. My house was the same house. Same furniture, same windows, same bird feeder outside. But the person inside, it was different. I was different. And she could see it. Patricia and I went to a little watercolor exhibit at the community center that weekend. Local artists, some quite skilled and some quite brave. I stood in front of a painting of a harbor at dusk and felt something move in me. The way light had been laid down in thin washes of color. The way the water seemed to breathe. I thought about how much I still wanted to learn. About color and light and the patience it takes to build something delicate without gripping it too hard. Patricia noticed me standing there a long time and came to stand beside me. She did not say anything. She just stood there with me, which was exactly the right thing to do. By summer, my herb garden was producing more than I could use alone. I began bringing bundles of basil and rosemary to my watercolor class, to Dottie, to the neighbors on either side of me who I had never properly gotten to know. The neighbor to the left was a retired teacher named James who grew tomatoes and was delighted by the basil. We started trading, his tomatoes for my herbs, and by midsummer we had a pleasant habit of talking over the fence in the early evening when the heat of the day had passed. Simple neighborly things that I had never had time for before because I had always been somewhere else, driving to help people who did not stop to ask how I was. Lily and Noah came to visit for a weekend in July. Daniel dropped them off on a Friday afternoon and picked them up Sunday morning. It was the first time I had the grandchildren to myself in my own house with no particular agenda. We baked blueberry muffins. We went to the park. We watched a movie on the sofa under my big wool blanket even though it was summer because Lily said blankets are for whenever you want them. We walked to the library and each of them chose 3 books. Noah chose books about insects, which should have surprised no one given the caterpillar photo. Lily chose books about horses and also one about rocks because, she told me very seriously, rocks are underrated. On Saturday evening after the children were in bed, I sat on the back porch in the dark listening to the insects in the garden and looking at the shapes of my sunflowers against the last bit of light in the sky. I thought about Lily's remark about blankets being for whenever you want them. Children know something important that adults spend years learning and forgetting and learning again. Comfort is not something you have to earn. You are allowed to reach for what feels good and warm simply because you are alive and it is there. I had spent too many years believing I had to suffer before I was allowed to rest. I was done with that. When Daniel came to pick up the children Sunday morning, he stood in my kitchen while the children ran around gathering their things, and he looked at me for a moment in a way that reminded me of when he was small, a particular direct looking that meant he was feeling something too big to say quickly. Then he said, "Mom, you seem really good." I said I was. He said, "I mean it. You seem like yourself." I forgot what that looked like. I did not know what to say to that, so I just hugged him. He hugged me back the way he used to before everything got complicated. Both arms, no rush. It was a small thing. But small things are where the real life is. Autumn came again. 1 full year had passed since the birthday phone call. I had not marked the anniversary in any particular way, but I noticed it, quietly. The way you notice a scar that has healed. It still tells a story, but it no longer hurts when you touch it. I had a different life now than I had 12 months ago. Not a perfect life. Not a life without loss or loneliness or the particular ache of a mother who loves her child even when that child has not always been kind. But a life that was mine. A life I had chosen and was continuing to choose. Day by day, cup of tea by cup of tea, painting by painting, conversation by conversation. Dottie organized a little gathering at her house in October. Just 6 of us from the watercolor class, dinner and conversation, and someone bringing a surprisingly good apple cake. We sat around her big dining table under a warm light and talked about everything. Dottie told a story about her youngest son that made everyone laugh. Frances, our teacher, brought photos of a painting trip she had taken to the coast. I told them about Lily's conviction that rocks are underrated, and everyone agreed that Lily sounded like someone worth knowing. It was such a simple evening. But I drove home through the dark streets feeling held by something I could not quite name. In November I took a weekend trip by myself, the first time I had traveled alone in many years. I drove to a small town 3 hours away that I had read about, known for its bookshops and its old mill and its walking trails along a river. I booked a room at a bed and breakfast, a small cozy room with a window looking out at a maple tree that had gone entirely red. I arrived on a Friday evening and ate dinner alone at a little restaurant and read my book and did not feel lonely at all, which surprised me. I felt instead like very good company for myself, which is perhaps the most useful feeling a person can develop. I walked the river trail both mornings, leaves coming down around me in the cold air, the river running fast and clear over smooth stones. I sat on a wooden bench for a long time on Saturday and just watched the water. There is something about moving water that settles the mind, the way it keeps going without hurrying, finding its way around whatever is in its path, not forcing anything, just moving toward where it is going with all the patience in the world. I thought about patience. I had patience for everyone else for so long. It was time to have it for myself too. To let my own life move at the pace it needed to. I brought home a small painting from a gallery in that little town. Just a simple watercolor of the river, painted by a local artist. Nothing expensive but full of that same quality of moving light that had moved me in the harbor painting at the community center exhibit. I hung it in my kitchen, where I could see it from the table. Every morning when I sat with my tea it was there, the river in its quiet motion. It reminded me that things can be beautiful without being complicated. That forward is the right direction even when the path bends and you cannot yet see where it leads. Christmas that year was different from any Christmas I could recently remember. Daniel asked if they could come to me this time. All 4 of them, Clara and the children, said yes. I set the table properly, with the good plates I almost never used and candles and cloth napkins. I made the meal I had always made, the one that had been in my family since my own mother's kitchen, the smell of it filling the house all morning. When they arrived, the children came in first at a run. Noah with a drawing he had made for me rolled up under his arm, Lily with a small wrapped package she handed me immediately and then watched very seriously while I opened it. Inside the package was a smooth oval rock, gray with a streak of white through the middle, nestled in a little box Lily had decorated with stickers. She told me she had found it at the park and that it was a special rock and that she wanted me to have it because I would appreciate it properly. I held it in my palm and told her she was absolutely right, that it was a very special rock and that I would keep it on my desk where I could see it every day. She looked satisfied in the way only children look when they have done exactly the right thing and know it. I still have that rock. It is on my desk right now. Clara was different that day than she had been at other family gatherings. Quieter in a thoughtful way rather than in the way that had always made me feel unwelcome. She helped in the kitchen without being asked. She asked me questions about the watercolor class and looked at the river painting and said she liked it. She played a card game with the children after dinner while Daniel and I sat at the table with our coffee and talked. It was not a perfect afternoon. There were still awkward moments, places where old hurt lived just beneath the surface. But we were all trying. And trying when it is genuine is not nothing. After they left that evening and the house was quiet again, I washed the dishes slowly and put the good plates back where they lived. I wiped down the table and blew out the last candle. I made a small cup of tea and took it to the chair by the window. Outside it was dark and still. The bird feeder was empty. In the morning I would fill it again. I thought about the year just ending, the one that had begun with a phone call that broke something open and had slowly, not easily, not neatly, but slowly become the year I came back to myself. Not a self I had to perform or earn or shrink down to fit. Just myself. Tired and glad and still learning. The new year arrived, and with it the particular feeling of a door standing open. I sat down in early January and wrote a list. Not resolutions in the usual sense. Not promises I was making to be better or different or more disciplined. Just a list of things I wanted to do because I wanted to do them. Take a longer painting workshop. Drive to visit Patricia. Learn to make proper bread. Read the books on my shelf that I had been meaning to get to for years. Walk more. Call Ruth every week. Fill the bird feeder every morning without fail. Small things. Real things. Things that would fill a day with something worth having. I did take that longer painting workshop in February, 5 days at the art center where I had gone before. Elliot was teaching again and he remembered my lavender painting, which pleased me more than it probably should have. By the end of the 5 days I had painted 6 pieces, some of them quite bad and one of them something I was genuinely proud of, a small image of my herb garden in summer, the pots along the porch railing, the light coming in at an angle. When I hung it next to the river painting in my kitchen, I stood back and looked at them together and thought, I made those. With my own hands and my own time. Nobody can take that. Patricia's visit in the spring was even better the second time. We had fallen back into the rhythm of our old friendship so thoroughly by then that she arrived, and it was as if no time had passed. The comfortable kind of no time where you pick up exactly where you left off without any performance or explanation required. We walked to the farmer's market on her first morning and she bought 3 jars of local honey and a bunch of peonies for the kitchen table. She stood in my garden and admired the sunflower seedlings just coming up. She met Dottie, who was dropping off some extra basil, and the two of them hit it off immediately in the way that good-natured people always do. One evening that spring, Daniel called with something in his voice that made me listen more carefully. He said that he and Clara had been talking, really talking, and that they had decided they wanted to pay back the money they had borrowed. He said they could not do it all at once, but that they were going to send a portion each month until it was done. He said he knew it was overdue and that he was sorry it had taken this long. I was quiet for a moment. Then I told him I was glad they were doing it, not just for the money but because it meant something about how they were choosing to move through the world. That choosing to honor old debts is a way of becoming the kind of people worth knowing. The money began arriving in small amounts each month. Each time I noted it in my little household book the way I noted any income, matter-of-factly, without ceremony. But there was something quietly important about it, the same thing that had been important about Clara's voicemail and Daniel's letter. Not the thing itself but what it said underneath the thing. That they were willing to put in effort when it did not benefit them immediately. That they were trying to be accountable. These are the kinds of things you cannot fake for very long. And I had been around long enough to know the difference between performance and genuine shift. Summer came back around, my second summer of what I had started privately calling my own life. The garden was even more ambitious than the year before. James from next door had suggested we put in a shared bed along the fence line between our properties. So we did, tomatoes and squash on his side, beans and cucumbers on mine, the whole thing tended by both of us in easy companionship. On summer evenings we would sometimes sit on the low fence between our properties with cold glasses of lemonade, and watch what we had grown together and talk about nothing in particular. Simple, good neighborly life. Lily and Noah came for 2 weeks in July that summer, longer than before. We had a proper routine that they seemed to find deeply satisfying in the way children are satisfied by predictability that feels chosen rather than imposed. Mornings we would tend the garden, water things, check on things, Lily keeping a little notebook of observations. Afternoons we went to the park or the library or on small adventures, the kind that require only time and curiosity. Evenings we cooked dinner together, the children each with a small job to do, Noah in charge of washing vegetables, Lily in charge of setting the table with what she called flair. On the last evening of their visit, after dinner, the 3 of us sat on the back porch watching the fireflies come out. Lily said she wanted to catch one and I said we could try, and so we did. The 3 of us moving slowly through the grass in the half-dark, hands cupped. Noah caught one first and held it gently up to see the light pulse in his hands, and then opened his fingers and let it go. Lily caught one just after and held it just as gently and just as briefly. We stood there watching the fireflies for a long time after that. Not trying to catch any more, just watching. That is all you really need to do with beautiful things. Just watch and let them be. When Daniel came to pick them up the next morning, Lily threw her arms around my waist and said she wanted to come back for Christmas. I said she was always welcome, that my house was always glad to have her in it. Noah hugged me more briefly in the way of 8-year-old boys who are also deeply loving but will not show it in front of other people. As they drove away, I stood on the front porch and waved until the car was out of sight. Then I went inside and stood in my kitchen, which was very quiet and a little emptier than it had been for 2 weeks. I let myself feel that for a moment. The good ache of love that has been given and received, and is now only waiting to see the people it belongs to again. Autumn arrived again, and with it something I had not expected. One evening in September I received an email from the Community Arts Center where Francis taught our watercolor class. They were putting together a small group show of student work from the past year, and they wanted to include one of my pieces if I was willing. I read the email 3 times and then sat back in my chair and laughed, the surprised kind. I emailed back and said yes, I would be honored. Francis called the next day to tell me which piece she had in mind. It was the herb garden painting, the one of the pots on my porch railing in the summer light. She said it had a quality she could not quite explain. Presence, she said, like someone who actually knows what they love. The opening was on a Thursday evening in October. I brought Ruth, who had driven up for the weekend just for it. Dottie was there. James from next door came, which surprised and touched me. Patricia sent a bunch of flowers to my house that morning with a note that said she was proud of me. I stood in that small bright room and looked at my little painting on the wall next to the work of other people who had spent a year learning to see more clearly. And I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not just happy. Not just proud. By myself and by people who had chosen, without obligation, to come and stand beside me. Daniel and Clara came to the opening. I had mentioned it to Daniel in passing, not expecting anything. But they arranged a sitter and drove over and stood in front of my herb garden painting for a long moment. Clara said it made her feel like summer. Daniel put his arm around my shoulders the way he used to when he was young and proud of me for something small I had done, a meal that came out right, a funny story well told. We stood there, the 3 of us, looking at the thing I had made, and whatever was still tender between us was held gently inside that moment, not erased, not ignored, but held. Which is all any of us can really ask of each other. By the time another winter settled in, I had stopped measuring my life by what I had given and what I had gotten back. I had stopped keeping the ledger, not because the unfairness had not been real, but because living inside the ledger had made me smaller than I ever needed to be. I was 68 now, not old in the way I had once feared aging, not diminished, just further along the road, with more behind me and still enough ahead to matter. I had a herb garden and a watercolor class and a friend named Dottie and a sister named Patricia and a neighbor named James and a grandchild named Lily who believed in the dignity of rocks. I had a son who was trying and a daughter-in-law who was trying and 2 small children who loved me freely and completely. What I had learned, in the hard and roundabout way that most real things are learned, was that love cannot be constructed from obligation. You cannot build a lasting thing from duty and debt and the exhausting work of making yourself necessary. What you can build it from is presence, genuine and chosen presence. The willingness to show up not because you are needed but because you want to be there. The willingness to say the true thing even when it is uncomfortable. The willingness to let people go when they are not treating you well and to welcome them back when they have learned to do better. This is what love looks like when it is healthy. I know that now. On the anniversary of the birthday call, I made myself a proper breakfast, eggs and good bread and a pot of real coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with Lily's rock in front of me and the river painting on the wall and the herb garden painting that I had brought home after the show ended and the bird feeder outside catching the early light. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel bitter. I felt something quieter and more lasting than either of those things. I felt at home in my own life, which is, after all, the only home that is always available to you. The only one no one can take away. Ruth asked me once, on one of our long phone calls, what advice I would give to another woman in the position I had been in a year ago. A woman who had poured everything out and found herself empty and still reaching. I thought about it for a while. Then I said, fill your own cup first. Not selfishly, not at anyone's expense, but first. Because you cannot give what you do not have and you cannot be truly loved by people who have only ever known you as a source. You have to be a person before you can be a mother or a grandmother or a friend or a neighbor. A whole person with a name and a life and things you love that belong entirely to you. Start there. Everything else follows. My name is Margaret. I am 68 years old. I have a herb garden that smells like summer even in memory. I have a painting of a river on my kitchen wall and another one of my own porch in the summer light. I have a granddaughter who keeps a notebook of garden observations and a grandson who releases fireflies gently back into the dark. I have a son who is learning and a sister who calls on Sundays and a friend who brings seedlings and laughs loud enough to fill a room. I have a bird feeder that I fill every morning without being asked. And I have finally, at the age of 68, after a lifetime of giving and a hard year of learning, learned the most important thing: how to be enough for myself. And if you found yourself in my shoes, what would you have done? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Write to me and tell me your story. For more stories like this one, please like this video, subscribe to Godfred's Storytime, and come back soon. There are many more stories waiting for you. With warmth and love, until next time.